Why are we paying you this much? That's the first thing Brent said as he barged into my office, waving a spreadsheet like it was a verdict. No greeting, no context, just a smug smile that told me he thought he'd found an easy target to carve up for his cost savings plan. I sat there stunned, listening to a man who barely knew my name tell me I was a burden to eliminate. He had no idea the one clause he never bothered to read would flip everything. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I was reviewing thermal resonance composite test data when Brent pushed my office door open without knocking, the hinges slamming against the wall like he owned the place. He'd been at Crestline Materials Group for exactly 8 days, just long enough to memorize buzzwords, not long enough to understand anything I'd built over the last 14 years. He stood there in his tailored suit, arms crossed, pretending patience while radiating the kind of arrogance only someone both insecure and newly promoted could carry. When I finally looked up, he tossed a printed spreadsheet across my keyboard. "Explain why we're paying you this much," he said, the corners of his mouth pulling into that smirk people wear when they think they've trapped you. No good morning, no context, just a demand. My salary, bonus schedule, and royalty percentages were highlighted in neon yellow like evidence in a criminal trial. I kept my voice steady, though inside a spark of dread flickered. "You'll need to be more specific," I said. "All of it," he replied. "This is excessive." He said excessive like I'd stolen something. 14 years of engineering breakthroughs, reimagining cooling systems used by half the industrial plants on the West Coast, had been reduced to a number on his cost-cutting worksheet. Brent leaned closer. "Starting next quarter, your compensation is being realigned to current market standards. You'll be down 35%. Shouldn't be a problem if you're confident in your work." It wasn't a question. It was a decree. He didn't understand that the composites he dismissed as legacy systems were the reason Crestline's licensing revenue remained stable through 2 recessions. He didn't understand that I wasn't some interchangeable engineer, but the architect of the core technology his whole division depended on. He didn't understand much of anything, really, but what stung wasn't the ignorance. It was the humiliation. Brent had delivered his blow like he expected me to crumple, like the decision had already been rubber-stamped behind closed doors, like I was a cost he could erase with a signature. And the worst part? He couldn't even be bothered to hide the satisfaction in his voice. "The new contract will be ready Friday," he added, tapping the door frame. "Legal reports to me now. No need to loop them in." Then he walked out, leaving the door wide open behind him, as if the conversation had been a minor housekeeping task, something barely worth his time. I stared at the spreadsheet, my coffee turning cold, the taste of burnt grounds lingering in the air. I should have felt panic or anger, but what washed over me instead was a strange stillness, a sense that something important had just shifted. Because here's the truth Brent didn't know. Years earlier, during another reign of misguided executives, my lawyer had insisted on a protection clause so airtight it bordered on prophetic. A clause Brent had never bothered to find. He thought he could cut me down in the name of efficiency. He had no idea he'd just pulled the first pin from a minefield he didn't even know he was standing on. I waited until Brent's footsteps faded down the hallway before I closed my office door and locked it, something I had never done in 14 years at Crestline. My hands didn't shake, and that surprised me. Maybe it was the shock numbing everything, or maybe it was the quiet certainty that if he'd come in with arrogance, I needed to meet the situation with clarity. I opened the lowest drawer of my desk, the one I rarely touched except during annual reviews, and pulled out a thick burgundy folder. Its edges were worn soft from age, though I hadn't opened it in almost a decade. The last time I'd held it was during the leadership shakeup of 2014, when another cost-cutting executive came in swinging and nearly gutted half the engineering team. Back then, my attorney had looked me dead in the eye and said, "We're not leaving you exposed, not after what you've built." She'd insisted we add protections even though I thought she was being dramatic. I set the folder on my desk and flipped it open. My employment contract, addendums, patent royalty schedules, licensing agreements, it was all organized exactly the way she had left it. I skimmed past the boilerplate until I reached the section I remembered but had nearly forgotten about in its specifics. Clause 14b, Unilateral Modification and Compensation Safeguard. I read it once, then again more slowly. My breath eased for the first time since Brent had thrown the spreadsheet onto my keyboard. The clause was simple, almost elegant. If my compensation was reduced by more than 15% without documented performance issues, Crestline would be required to initiate a full acquisition valuation of my technology portfolio. Not renegotiate, not revisit, initiate, mandatory. The valuation formula was tied directly to our annual composite licensing revenue, a figure Brent definitely didn't understand and clearly never bothered to check. Last year, that number was $38 million. The multiplier was 7.5. Even doing the math in my head, I knew what it meant. A valuation of roughly $287 million. Crestline would either have to restore my compensation or buy out my patents at that price. Brent's realignment wasn't just illegal under the contract. It was financially catastrophic. And the thing that sealed it? My original attorney had filed this contract separately from the standard HR system, knowing future executives loved shortcuts and summaries. Brent never saw it because he never asked. I took a breath and forwarded the critical pages to my personal email. Then I picked up the phone and called Marina Fields, Crestline's general counsel. She answered on the second ring, sounding distracted. "Talia, I was actually about to call you. Brent pushed some changes through last night that I just saw an hour ago." "Did he send you my contract?" I asked. Silence, then papers rustling, a muffled voice in the background. "What contract?" she said finally. "The 2010 agreement, the one tied to my composite technology." Another long stretch of silence. I could picture Marina flipping through files, scanning databases, realizing what she hadn't known she'd missed. "Give me a second," she said. I waited. She returned with her voice tighter, almost strangled. "Talia, is this clause still active?" "Very much so," I said. "Brent cut me 35%. More silence, then a whisper of dread. "Oh my God, that triggers mandatory valuation. Talia, he didn't tell anyone. He didn't give us time to review. He's completely blindsided us." "He said legal reports to him now," I replied. "He said he didn't need to involve you." I heard Marina inhale sharply. "He's out of his mind. Do not respond to anything he sends, and don't speak to him. I need to call Evan." She hung up without waiting for a response. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of the moment settle. Brent thought he'd delivered a clean victory, a neat little spreadsheet, a tidy cost reduction. What he'd actually done was crack open a fault line beneath the entire company, and the earth hadn't even started shaking yet. The rest of the morning moved strangely, like time kept tripping over itself. I tried to get back to the composite test data in front of me, but every number blurred into the next. My mind kept circling the same truth. Brent hadn't just crossed a line, he'd stepped directly onto the one trapdoor I never expected anyone to find, let alone open. At 1:06 p.m., the first aftershock hit. An email blasted to the entire engineering division, signed by Brent, dripping with artificial enthusiasm. As we move toward a leaner and more competitive Crestline, compensation packages will be adjusted to better align with contemporary market benchmarks. I read it twice. He didn't name me, but I felt the spotlight all the same. Market benchmarks. Compensation alignment. The kind of vague language executives used when they didn't want to admit what they were actually doing. 3 paragraphs in, there it was. Legacy cost. Optimization. Not once, not twice, 3 times. 14 years of building the technology that funded half the company's operations, and somehow I'd been reduced to a legacy cost. The kind you cut with a cheerful PowerPoint slide. My office suddenly felt too small, the air too warm. I pushed away from my desk and walked to the cafeteria, not because I was hungry, but because I needed distance from that email before I shattered something. Maria was at the register, as she always was during the afternoon rush. She'd worked at Crestline long enough to know everyone's coffee preferences, bad days, good weeks, and who was avoiding who after tense meetings. "Turkey wrap?" she asked automatically. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. I pointed at something on the menu without looking, and her eyes sharpened. You okay? She asked quietly. You never get that one. Long day, I said. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. She handed me the sandwich, her smile kind but knowing. I walked back to my office, sat down, and stared at the untouched food until my desk phone rang at 3:03. It was Marina. Evan wants to meet tomorrow morning, 8 sharp. Conference room C. Should I bring representation? I asked. That's your call, she said, sounding exhausted. But Talia, this is going to move fast. She hung up, leaving the silence thick in the room. I spent the rest of the afternoon pretending to work, though nothing stuck. My mind kept replaying Brent's voice, the smirk, the arrogance. He truly believed cutting me down made him powerful. At 4:22, my inbox pinged again, a summary of tomorrow's meeting attendees. CEO, General Counsel, 2 members of the financial oversight team, and for reasons that felt almost comedic, Brent. He had no idea why he'd been invited. That thought almost made me laugh. Almost. By 5:00, the building had begun to empty. I locked my office again before leaving, another thing I had never done until today. Driving home, the city lights blurred against the drizzle on my windshield. My stomach twisted with a mix of dread and anticipation, the kind of electric tension before a storm breaks. I spent that night at my kitchen table, the contract folder spread open like an old spine. My dinner sat untouched. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of my old apartment's wooden beams. I kept asking myself the same question. What happens if I win? And an even harder one, what happens if I don't? The truth sat heavy in my chest. Tomorrow wouldn't just be a meeting. It would be the beginning of the quake Brent had unknowingly set off. And by morning, someone's career would be unrecognizable. Maybe his, maybe mine, maybe both. By the time I arrived at Crestline the next morning, the air felt different. Tense, charged, like even the building knew something was coming. I walked past employees chatting over coffee, oblivious to the fact that upstairs, their newly minted director of corporate strategy had lit a fuse no one could put out. The elevators opened onto the executive floor, quiet in a way that made my heartbeat feel loud. Conference room C sat at the end of the hallway, its frosted glass glowing with early morning sun. Through it, I could see silhouettes, Marina at the table, Evan standing near the window, 2 finance officers whispering over a laptop, and one figure pacing in nervous circles. Brent. He looked like a man who wanted to appear in control but couldn't quite remember how to fake it. I stepped inside. Every head turned, no one spoke for a moment, and the silence felt deliberate, as if the room itself was deciding how to receive me. Evan nodded. Talia, thank you for coming. His tone was neutral, but I recognized the strain in his voice. This wasn't going to be a routine correction of a managerial overstep. This was crisis containment. He gestured to a seat across from him. I sat. Brent stayed in the corner, arms wrapped tight across his chest like he was bracing for impact. Marina opened a folder. We need to walk through the sequence of events, she said. Talia, tell us exactly what happened yesterday morning. I kept my voice steady. Brent entered my office without notice. He presented a compensation adjustment reflecting a 35% reduction. He stated legal now reported to him and the decision was already approved. A muscle twitched in Evan's jaw. Before he could respond, Brent cut in, his voice too bright. Let's be clear, that adjustment was part of a broader realignment initiative. Nothing personal, just necessary efficiency. The words hung there clumsy and hollow. Marina slid a page across the table toward Evan and the finance officers. Any reduction over 15% triggers Clause 14B in her contract. Mandatory valuation, mandatory negotiation, no exceptions. One of the finance officers, a woman named Caro, tapped her keyboard and turned her laptop toward Evan. Based on last year's composite licensing revenue, she said, that valuation is approximately $287 million. Brent blinked rapidly. That can't be right. That contract isn't in the current HR records. Because you never asked for the original file, Marina said, her voice low and dangerously calm. It's stored separately for legal integrity. This is standard for proprietary technology agreements. We can renegotiate, Brent said quickly. Update the terms, fold it into the modern compensation framework. She can't expect the company to honor a document from over a decade ago. We can, Caro said, and we must. The clause is binding. The other finance officer looked directly at Evan. If we proceed with Brent's adjustment, we owe Talia a buyout. And if we trigger that buyout, we lose control of the core composites that support most of our industrial contracts. Evan exhaled slowly, then turned to Brent. Why didn't you bring this to legal before making changes? Why didn't you follow review protocol? Brent straightened, grasping for authority he no longer held. Because this company has been bleeding unnecessary spending for years, and no one has had the guts to take action. You put me in this role to clean up inefficiencies, and that's what I did. You did it illegally, Marina said, and without understanding the implications. Evan leaned forward. Brent, step outside. I'm director of... Step outside. Brent's lips thinned, but he obeyed, leaving the door half open, as if he expected to be called back in triumph. When it clicked shut behind him, the room felt bigger, quieter. Evan folded his hands. Talia, tell us what you want. The question landed softly but carried weight. I let myself breathe. I want to keep working, I said. I want to finish the composite framework. I want my team protected, but I will not stay under someone who sees me as a cost instead of a creator. Caro nodded. If we restore compensation, Brent's entire restructuring plan collapses. Then you have a choice, I said. Choose the person who built what you're trying to protect, or choose the man who nearly detonated the company because he didn't read a contract. Silence followed, heavy, contemplative. Evan leaned back, the morning light casting long shadows across the table. Give me 24 hours, he said finally. We'll determine our path. I stood, thanked them, and walked out past Brent, who stared at me with a mixture of confusion and fear, because for the first time, he sensed the ground shifting beneath him. And he didn't know yet that the real collapse had already begun. I barely slept that night. Even after the meeting, even after seeing Brent's face go sheet white when he realized he'd activated a clause that could bankrupt the company, my mind refused to slow down. I kept replaying every detail, the unread contract, the arrogance, the moment Evan told him to step outside like a child sent to the hallway, but nothing prepared me for what happened the next morning. At 9:11 a.m., my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in my chest pressed me to answer. This is Talia. Dr. Mercer, a smooth voice replied. My name is Victor Hale from Brightcore Technologies. I've followed your work for years. I hear you might be open to alternative opportunities. I froze. Brightcore was Crestline's most aggressive competitor, cutthroat, well-funded, notorious for trying to poach talent by any means necessary. How did you get this number? I asked. A mutual acquaintance mentioned that your position may soon be negotiable. My stomach tightened. I'm not looking for new opportunities. You might reconsider, Victor said. We would offer executive-level autonomy, full funding for your next-generation composites, and purchase rights for your entire portfolio. Conservatively, you're looking at north of $290 million. He paused as if letting the number settle. A clean exit, total control of your future. I hung up without a goodbye. My hands trembled for the first time since this mess began. I immediately dialed Marina. She answered on the first ring. Tell me everything, she said. I repeated the conversation word for word. There was a long stretch of silence where I could hear her breathing, calculating. Then, Talia, I checked Brent's records last night. Her voice dropped. He has ties to Brightcore. Ties? I repeated. He sits on the advisory board of a venture fund that holds significant Brightcore stock, she said. If Brightcore acquires your patents, their valuation spikes. That fund spikes. Brent's options spike. My throat tightened. So this wasn't about efficiency. No, Marina said. He was trying to force you out so Brightcore could swoop in. The email blast, the rushed reduction, cutting legal out. It wasn't incompetence. It was intent. I gripped the edge of my desk. That's sabotage. That's corporate misconduct, she said, and potentially fraud. Within an hour, an emergency board meeting was called. I wasn't invited, but Marina texted updates in real time. At 12:14 p.m., they're reviewing his phone records. At 12:51, there are 6 calls between Brent and Victor yesterday. At 1:23, emails uncovered, discussions about your valuation. Brent told him to move fast before she activates the clause. I stared at those words until they blurred. He had been trying to weaponize my own invention against me, betting that I'd panic and walk away before the board realized what he'd done. At 2:40, another text. Board furious. Some want him fired immediately. At 3:06, Evan pushing removal for cause. At 3:58, they're voting. Then, at 4:12, unanimous. Brent is being terminated. I let out a breath so deep my ribs ached. Not triumph, just release. The kind you feel when a storm that's been circling finally breaks. At 4:27, I saw him walk out of the building through my office window, security escorting him while he carried a cardboard box that looked too light to contain anything meaningful. For a moment, I wondered if he even understood the magnitude of what he'd done. Doubtful. People like Brent always assumed the fallout would land on someone else. But he'd run out of someone else's. My computer pinged again. This time, it was an email from Evan. Talia, please come in tomorrow morning. We need to finalize next steps. Next steps. The words felt heavy. I had defeated the man who tried to dismantle me, but winning the war was something different. And tomorrow, I would decide whether I stayed to rebuild or walked away with everything I had ever created. When I walked into Evan's office the next morning, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not tension, not chaos, silence. The kind that follows a disaster after everyone finally stops running. Papers were neatly stacked on his desk, but he didn't bother pretending to work. He was waiting. Talia, he said, standing up as I entered, please sit. I did. The chair felt colder than usual. He studied me for a moment, then exhaled like he'd been rehearsing what to say but still wasn't sure where to begin. First, he said, I'm sorry. What Brent did was reckless, unethical, and dangerous. To the company, to the technology, to you. I didn't respond. I wanted him to keep talking. I wanted to hear what Crestline thought my worth was, when the threat of losing everything was no longer theoretical, but documented in the minutes of a board meeting. We removed him for cause, Evan continued. His access has been revoked. Legal is handling the rest. Good, but that wasn't why I was there. Talia, he said carefully, the board understands what your work means to Crestline, and they understand the value of your contract. We want to offer full restoration of your compensation, plus a 20% increase across both salary and royalties. He slid a packet across the desk, and a 5-year contract renewal. I didn't touch it. If I'd been younger, less tired, less tested, I might have seen this as victory. But now, all I felt was a wary heaviness. A company that valued me would have never put a man like Brent above my work. A company that truly understood my contributions wouldn't need a clause to respect them. Before I even look at that, I said, I need answers. Evan nodded, bracing. Who will oversee engineering moving forward? You will, he said immediately. Direct report to me. No intermediaries. No more restructuring experiments from operations. Budget authority? Yours. Project prioritization? Yours. He hesitated, then added, It's what should have been in place already. I kept my face calm, but inside something sharp loosened. For years I'd fought small battles, pushing for resources, defending timelines, justifying research phases against people who barely understood the science. But this wasn't about winning a round. This was about rewriting the rules. I have another condition, I said. If Crestline licenses any derivatives of my composite technology, I want veto rights. specifically tied to humanitarian access. Evan frowned. Humanitarian access. My work is used in cooling systems that support infrastructure in regions with fragile power grids, I said. I will not allow Crestline to license to companies that exploit or price gouge developing communities. If the application undermines fair access, I want the authority to block it. He leaned back, eyebrows raised, processing. It wasn't the kind of demand most engineers made, but I wasn't most engineers, and this wasn't most technology. You want ethical control, he said slowly, not just financial. Yes. He thought for about 20 seconds, long enough to make me wonder if he would push back, but then he picked up the phone, dialed Marina, and said, add a clause granting Talia veto authority over any derivative licensing that intersects with humanitarian infrastructure. She'll send exact language. He hung up. Done. I wasn't expecting it to be that easy, but maybe it wasn't ease. It was desperation. They had stared straight into the abyss Brent opened and realized losing me wasn't just expensive, it was existential. One more thing, I said, because the window was open and I would not leave anything unsaid. I want an expanded mentorship budget, 4 more doctoral candidates. They're the future of the program. Approved, he said without hesitation. Is that everything? I finally picked up the contract packet. It was still warm from the printer. I flipped through it slowly, reading every line. Financial restoration, royalty escalation, reporting restructuring, protection, safeguards, authority. It was the contract I would have negotiated years ago if I'd believed Crestline would ever need my protection. Now they needed it desperately, and I needed something too. The feeling that staying meant choosing my work, not surrendering to the company. When I reached the signature page, I paused. Evan, I said quietly, this only exists because Brent detonated a clause he never bothered to understand. If that clause hadn't been there, I know, he said, and he looked genuinely ashamed. I signed. My hand didn't tremble, not out of pride or victory, but something steadier. Resolve. Evan added his signature beside mine. Thank you, he said, for staying. But the truth was simpler and far heavier. I wasn't staying for Crestline. I was staying for the work, the breakthroughs waiting in the lab, the students who trusted me, the communities our technology could protect. And now, finally, I had the authority to ensure the work wouldn't be corrupted by someone else's ambition. The decision was mine again. And this time, it felt like power, not survival. When I walked back into my lab that afternoon, the familiar hum of equipment felt like a heartbeat I hadn't heard in days. Relief didn't wash over me in a single wave. It arrived slowly, settling into the corners of the room like dust illuminated by sunlight. I picked up the composite sample I'd been testing before all of this began, running my thumb along its smooth surface, and for the first time since Brent barged into my office, I felt grounded again. A notification buzzed on my phone. It was the official company-wide announcement. Effective immediately, Brent Corin is departing Crestline to pursue personal opportunities. Engineering will now report directly to the CEO. My name appeared twice in the memo, once acknowledging my leadership, once outlining the new structure. Corporate language, sanitized and careful, but underneath it ran the truth. They'd nearly lost everything because one man thought he could bulldoze a system he didn't understand. At 10:33, one of my doctoral candidates, Rowan, knocked on my door. Dr. Mercer, she said, her voice trembling a little. I heard something happened upstairs? I just nodded. He's gone, I said simply. We're moving forward. She relaxed visibly, then handed me her test results, flow rate improvements that pushed our projections another 10% higher than expected. I smiled for the first time in days and told her to start drafting the findings for the next patent submission. The afternoon passed in the quiet rhythm of real work. No crises, no posturing, just equations, test runs, revisions, and the kind of progress that can only be made when leadership stops treating innovation like a line item. Around 4, I stepped outside for air. Through the glass windows, I saw the empty parking spot where Brent used to park his spotless black sedan. It struck me how quickly the world erases people who mistake authority for strength. In the end, he'd left nothing behind but a cardboard box and a trail of emails implicating him in his own downfall. I drove home as the sun dipped behind the skyline, painting the buildings gold. For the first time all week, the drive wasn't clouded by dread. My apartment felt warm when I walked in, the wooden floors creaking softly under my feet. I made pasta, poured a glass of water, and sat at the same kitchen table where I'd stared down fear just days earlier. Now the folder with my contract lay closed beside me, signed, sealed, reinforced with clauses that protected both my work and the people it served. I thought about the offer from Brightcore, about the number that could have rewritten my life in an instant, about the ease of leaving everything behind, but I also thought about the cooling systems running in hospitals in rural Arizona, the stability they provided during heat waves, the communities who depended on them. That work mattered more than the fantasy of an exit. I chose to stay because I wasn't finished, because I finally had more than leverage. I had control, a quiet kind of victory, the kind that doesn't make noise but reshapes everything in its path. Tomorrow, I would go back to the lab. We were on the edge of a breakthrough, and this time no one would stand in the way. I didn't realize how much that week took out of me until everything finally quieted down. When you spend years carrying the weight of a department, a technology, a team, you forget you're not built to absorb blow after blow without consequence. When Brent walked into my office with that spreadsheet, I felt something slip inside me. Not fear, not anger, something heavier. The slow realization that the place I'd given 14 years of my life could treat me like a line item. That kind of shock doesn't fade quickly. It sits in your chest, it takes your sleep, it makes you question every sacrifice you ever justified as worth it. And yet, somewhere between digging out my old contract and facing a boardroom full of executives, I remembered something I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't fragile. I wasn't replaceable. The strength didn't come from yelling or fighting. It came from preparation, from the quiet decision I'd made years earlier to protect my work, my time, and my future. That clause didn't represent paranoia. It represented respect for myself long before anyone else bothered to show it. If there's anything to take from this, it's that your quiet efforts matter. The way you document, the way you plan, the way you hold on to the truth when someone tries to rewrite it, those things can save you when the ground shifts. My advice, if we were sitting over coffee and you asked me how to avoid what I went through: don't wait for recognition to protect your value. Don't let someone else decide what your work is worth, and don't assume fairness will arrive on its own. How to get started today. Keep copies of every important agreement. Update your personal records yearly. Write down wins and contributions as they happen. Don't dismiss small legal protections. They matter. Prepare now, even if you think you'll never need it. Have you ever had to stand your ground when someone underestimated you?